I had a question on your first plot, the one that shows the dividend growth. And you have two processes operating there. You have one, try to discourage people from using carbon-based or carbon products, and the dividends are going up. And I wanted to be sure that that part of the model that generated that graph included the disincentive for people to use or produce things, because I would expect that the fees that we're getting back are going to decline, or they should if we're being successful.
Yes, that's a good question. The answer is yes, the model does include that. This study goes out only 20 years, and they do expect that eventually, after that, the higher price will drive quantities down enough that the fee per unit will not be enough to compensate. But for the first 20 years, although the fee is going up and is driving demand and sales down, the fee per unit is higher, the dividend is higher every year, and so the total keeps going up for 20 or 30 years, and then after that, it does go down if we're succeeding.
I have two questions. One is, what do we say to our congressional representatives who are taking money from the petroleum companies? It's kind of, Norma Torres, I can say carbon fee and dividend all I want, and I don't know if she's going to be listening to me because she takes money from oil companies.
Her son got elected to the council in Pomona.
I know, I live in Pomona. Anyway, another thing that I wanted to ask, you didn't mention the problems with methane, which is a much greater, stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
Okay. Does anybody else from CCL want to try that first question? Have you lobbied Norma or any other member of Congress? Yeah? Well?
She wouldn't let us come and talk to her. We've gone 3 times with 3 different representatives. The last one had heard of us.
And you met with staff, but not with her? Yeah. Okay. We also have people lobbying Senator Ted Cruz, members of CCL in Texas. There was a caravan of CCL throughout the South this summer trying to raise more attention. In Texas, what they're asking Senator Cruz to do is not to filibuster the bill. That was before this election. And the only other thing we can say is, and I would say even more in Texas perhaps than with here, and I have said in Bakersfield, I went to Bakersfield 3 or 4 times and given talks there, Kevin McCarthy's backyard. These areas, and Kern County is the 5th largest oil-producing county in the country. These counties are going to be already suffering from climate change, just like everybody else. Oil field workers work outdoors, like farmers. Texas is going to be hit by higher sea level, worse hurricanes, rain bombs, drought, and heat waves, extreme heat waves, all affecting the state. They need to save their people. What is your plan for solving climate change if this is not good enough? Now, there are other problems that they raise in these meetings as well, even if you get an appointment with them. We simply have our case, and to Republicans, well, you heard the case, and we just try to persuade them with evidence. I've forgotten your second question already.
The second part was methane, and I think you had actually touched on it, but...
Yeah. Methane is the main component in natural gas, so that methane would be attached to fee at the upstream end where it comes out of the ground. Methane also leaks out of the production of natural gas, and it leaks out of the pipelines and under the cities. And that would not be something we could put a fee on. It is much more heat trapping than carbon dioxide, although it doesn't last for centuries and centuries the way CO2 does. It's a big problem. It also leaks out of landfills and cattle ranches. So this is not the solution to every single aspect of the problem. but it would make a huge difference in pushing us in the right direction toward getting control of climate change. Okay, number 3, number 4.
Has the lobby lobbied groups such as teachers, healthcare workers such as respiratory therapists, physicians, and nurses to join with you?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have at our national conference had presentations by healthcare professionals about the healthcare consequences of climate change. The California PTA has passed a resolution declaring that teaching kids about climate change is a priority. That's the PTA. So local PTA chapters are a place to go to see if those groups want to make a similar declaration, including to their communities and to their members of Congress. I don't know of any other direct collaborations, but many healthcare organizations for years now have been calling for serious climate action. The American Medical Association, the Nurses Association, public health professionals, and so they're working on that. Not necessarily supporting this particular proposal. But if we got a bill, see, this proposal has not been introduced as a formal bill yet, and the reason is that Republican staffers said if it came in as a Democratic bill, it would be dead on arrival. You want it to be bipartisan, you got to have Republican sponsors, and we've been waiting for Republican co-sponsors. And so it's not a bill yet. And because it's not a bill, most organizations like the AMA and the they don't take a position on things until they become bills because they'd be spending their whole time taking positions on things. So once it becomes a bill, then I think the strategy would be to line up a coalition of business, healthcare, faith groups, progressive groups, libertarian groups, all across the board. I didn't mention that CCL has a libertarian caucus, a conservative caucus, as well as a progressive one. Freeman.
I was wondering what you see as the power and advantages of a city taking a position on this. Suppose our city council in Claremont decided to take a positive position. What effect would that have?
Well, I think it would just amplify the voices of individuals and communities, and it would be, members of Congress pay close attention to things like this. For example, one member of that resolution and a member of the caucus is Ileana Ros-Lehtinen of Florida, very conservative Republican, very senior Republican, and the way our Jay Butera, our member, talked them into this was he lined up mayors from her district first and went to them and they got them each to endorse the idea of some kind of climate solution. And then he asked her for a meeting with the mayors and he brought them to her office. And she walked into the room and she said, I can't believe you guys are all here about this. Where do I sign? And I mentioned this to a Democratic member of Congress from California. She said, those are all the main rivals for her seat. If they are all on the same side of something, they're not going to run against her because she did this. Maybe that's not the only reason, but if cities do things, they do make a difference. And the second, now, after this election, a very important element is that if Congress is going to be paralyzed, the action is going to be moving to states and cities. And there's more than just passing this resolution that cities could be doing. There's an international compact of mayors, which cities have signed on to, and you pledge to do certain things to reduce the carbon emissions in your city and to adapt the city to it. There's also an organization of big cities, mega cities, called the C40, which is more demanding and accomplishing more. But 70% of world emissions come out of cities. So even if our government, our national government, is not doing something, city governments can be working on the problem at the same time. But I believe the Congress would definitely pay attention. Please.
Just several comments. I'm a member of CCL. I'll just mention that we also have another chapter in Claremont. The students have a chapter here at the colleges. I'm not sure I see any of them. The one leader had another commitment tonight, but there's also a chapter here. And I'll just mention that one reason I joined briefly is just the temperament of the organization, very non-confrontational. And the term that jumped out at me was that we're transpartisan, not partisan. And when we go in, I was fortunate to go back to Washington last year, went into several Republican offices, and they said, we like to meet with you. When Greenpeace comes in, they're very strident, they're shaking their fist. People tend to be overly strident. And when we come in, we're very, how can we work with you? What help you need? It's just very refreshing, even beyond climate change, just the temperament of trying to work together to find solutions. They find it very refreshing, and we get invited back. And I'll just say I went to a congressman's office, and I forget his nickname, but it was something like Mean Joe in Texas. He was featured as one of the poster boys for being against climate change, but he met with us just because he couldn't believe that we were not as strident as some of the other groups. So it was very refreshing. And when the time comes for a solution, they will tend to look towards the solutions that we've been working for maybe a decade finally to bring about. So really an investment over time.
Thank you for adding that. Yeah, one of the ideas is that we try to build a relationship with the people, the individuals we're talking to. That's what real professional lobbyists do. They're in there all the time. They're asking about your kids and did you get them into college, and they're bringing gifts. And you don't have to bring gifts, but if they know you, it's a different kind of thing than if you're a stranger. So maintaining relationships. I also meant to mention earlier that Citizens Climate Lobby is going to be featured on national television Wednesday night this week in this series of documentaries called Years of Living Dangerously. It's running on National Geographic Channel. And my network, it's at 7 o'clock on Wednesday nights. Years of Living Dangerously. They're going to be featuring Bradley Whitfield from TV Star interviewing Jay Butera about how he got this caucus started. So again, it's another sign that our organization is moving the needle a little bit.
So this carbon tax is something of a heavy lift politically, in part because folks focused early on cap and trade. Even our own state has focused heavily on cap and trade. Would you comment on that lift? Because it seems to me that there has to be a solution to the continuing effort to go towards this much more slippery cap and trade business that it allows for special dealings between companies and governments.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's the first question. Please comment.
I thought maybe you were about to say that a carbon tax is a heavy lift because it sounds like a tax. Quickly on that, Republicans do have a problem with this idea. They say, oh, well, that's a tax, and we've signed a pledge not to vote for any tax increases. And we have two answers for that. One is, usually a tax is a device for financing government. This money is not going to stay in the government. The government's not going to keep the money in this case. That's why we don't call it a tax. We call it a fee. But besides that, we need some solution to climate change, and this is a market-oriented solution. Once the fee or tax is in place, it's just about everything you want. You're going to have to hold hands and jump off the cliff together, and if you all do it together, maybe you can survive politically. On the cap and trade question, one of the ones that was asked earlier, certainly I was glad that California did take the lead, and both of these are means to the same end, and if either of them can help save us from climate change, I would be in favor of either, although my first choice would be carbon fee and dividend, and my main reasons are three. The dividend makes it fair. In California, we don't get a dividend, and so there are costs going up for low-income families without without that compensation. Also because the carbon fee and dividend proposal, this is at the national level now, comparing the two, will expand the economy because there's a dividend. Without it, there wouldn't be that stimulus. Cap and trade, I believe, would be more costly to administer, especially the carbon fee part and the dividend part would be cheaper than setting up emissions trading and defining all the products that have to be capped. I've read the California regulations. They're about 300 pages long, and the first 60 pages are definitions, what counts as a cold rolled steel, and so forth. That's because it has to be defensible in court. To impose a regulation on a company, you have to define exactly what you're regulating. But that means, too, that as markets change, you'll have to change the regulations to keep up with the market. And it, in fact, gives incentives to companies to, sometimes they can engineer their product out of a category by changing the product so that it's outside the regulations. You have all that to worry about. There are opportunities for lobbying for exceptions, and that's kind of what happened with the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill in Congress in 2009. Very complicated. They started handing out the permits, tradable permits, initially because they had so much opposition from the carbon-intensive industries. But once you've done all that, you may not have a cap that looks quite as secure and certain as it looked in the first place. It would be attractive if you had a cap that was really didn't have any holes in it, and you could be sure that emissions could not be higher than that. And a carbon fee or tax does not guarantee any particular level of emissions. It doesn't guarantee it. And finally, our proposal, I think, uses market competition to help drive costs down. So I think for the economy's cost, as opposed to the government's cost, this would be a way to save money for the economy. And finally, cap and trade, I think, is not going to pass in Congress. There's no point in bringing it up. Republicans say that's big government. We've rejected it twice. Forget about it. Somebody might also be thinking about what would happen to California if Washington passed this proposal, carbon fee and dividend, and California has cap and trade. And I'm not really an expert on the California proposal, but if someone here is, you can help me with this. But here's what I think would happen. I think Californians would be better off in 5 different ways. Number one, this federal program would cut California emissions faster than the California program does. I've looked at the price of carbon under California's cap. It's below $20 a ton. It's 15, 12, somewhere in there. Well, the first year, ours is going to be $15 a ton nationally. The second year, it's going to be $25 a ton nationally. It's going to be higher in the second year already, and it's going to be going up every year after that. So it's going to be moving California emitters away from what they're doing faster than they're forced to do by the California law. So in effect, I believe the California provisions would become redundant. There's no reason they'd have to be repealed necessarily, but I think the train will be moving ahead anyway. It does mean bad news for California that the revenue they're counting on to get from auctioning the permits in California will dry up, if I'm right. Companies won't need to buy these permits if they've already abated because of the federal law, which means that the state will have to come up with other ways to fund the things like the bullet train that they've been funding with this money. On the other hand, at the same time, if the dividends are coming into California, that means more income and more business. So I think there would be some offsetting increase in state revenue from sales taxes and income taxes. I don't know what the numbers would be. Second, I think California would be better off in the sense of California businesses, because Texas businesses and Florida businesses would be under the same regime as California. They no longer have any competitive disadvantage to worry about. It would be fairer to Californians because there's a dividend. There would be a border adjustment with our plan, which California doesn't have the authority to install, which will level the playing field with international competitors too. So I think they can be layered on top, one on top of the other, and California would be better off. That's my opinion.
Would you go back to the slide with that one? That's the one I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Could you answer the last bullet point there first and then the second to the last. What is the position of the organization on the last one there?
This one?
Yes.
Okay. Good point. Good question. Some petroleum products come out of the crude oil goes into the refinery, but not all of the products are burned. They incorporate some of the fossil fuels into plastic and asphalt. And the idea of this proposal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it does require burning the stuff to get any emissions. So we have a group of members at CCL who specialize in the oil industry, and a number of them have worked for many years in the oil industry and have become advocates of decarbonization. And they have debated this issue, and I've listened in on their debate a little bit. And I think the consensus view in that group is that the position of CCL should be that companies that make plastic should be able to apply for a rebate to Washington for the amount involved in the price they had to pay for the feedstock that's attributed to the carbon fee. We should not propose any rebates of any particular size. It should be in a response to a proposal, a request from a company. But we should not reject that idea, because if we did, it seems unfair because you're not burning the stuff, and that's the purpose of the plan. And they would kill it in Congress. There would be even more opposition than there already is. We might as well reduce the opposition. This is not the official position of our organization because it hasn't gotten that far. And it would actually have to be determined by the members of Congress who introduced the bill anyway. But I think our group, as far as I'm aware, is in favor of an exemption for this type.
So that's the official position of the organization?
It's not the official position of the
So
organization.
the organization does not support that proposal there?
It doesn't have a position on this issue about exempting those things.
In other words, they would still want to impose the tax, the fee.
As far as the organization proposal goes, and the one that's on the website, it just doesn't say anything about this. But I was giving you an inside discussion about what people are talking about inside the organization. But if Claremont were to endorse this proposal, it certainly wouldn't need to specify details like this. It could recommend carbon fee and dividend idea with a border adjustment, and as the state of California did, more or less, something like that.
Okay, and then the other question is the next bullet over. How do
The
you...
estimated cost for
yes.
administration. Okay, I looked into this. I have something for you. Some estimates have been put together by our headquarters staff based on comparing existing IRS programs and extrapolating, but not based on an extensive study counting up sort of dollar by dollar. And the estimate is about $6 billion averaged over several years at a time. This is meant to represent the fact that the first year probably will be startup costs that won't be repeated after they've finished setting up and training all the people and getting the software and created and so forth. So it probably would be higher than 6 in the first year and less than that in later years. But I would like to add, in answering that question, several major points. That sounds like a lot of money, $6 billion. The program is fully self-financing. That is, all these administrative costs will be covered by the carbon fee coming in. There would be no increased demand on the rest of the federal budget. Also, the revenue from the carbon fee will be rising smartly every year, illustrated by these estimates. Roughly $80 billion expected to come in the first year in total revenue from the carbon fee. This is not counting the border extra duties at the border. Up to $130 billion in just the second year. So you can see that as a share of revenue, the administrative costs go down every year. By the 6th year, the only thing they'll have to change is to increase the total of the payments by changing numbers in the software and then press send, and the payments go out. They are expecting, we hired also, independent of this cost question, we hired a Treasury expert, U.S. Treasury Department, who supervised the 2008 rebate checks. Do you remember that? When the Bush administration set out checks in the spring of 2008, he organized the administration of that whole program. We asked him to advise, how would you organize this dividend for our proposal? And I've read his proposal, his report, and it's fairly detailed, reflecting lots more than I would have even thought to consider. He says you use the IRS for this, not the Social Security Administration. Use income tax returns to define the household. Everybody who files a tax return would indicate how many dependents they have within the under 19, and we would use that to determine the amounts of the checks. People who don't file income taxes, we would use a form. There would be an extra form for those people, and they'd have to fill out and apply for it. The payments would be made, almost all of them, by direct deposit. They're getting over 90% of tax returns filed electronically now. And for people who don't have a bank account, they would have a debit card arrangement. He thought of just about everything. They would use contractors to hold down some of the administrative costs. How's that? Thank you for the question. Got one back here, and then.
I thought one of the geniuses was that all the money was collected and then became a dividend. So, in fact, not all of it is a dividend. Is that correct?
All except administrative costs.
So you can't say, yeah, okay.
That's right.
I just wanted.
All net of administrative costs.
Yeah.
That's right.
I really appreciate that what Robert was talking about the civil discourse that is promoted through the organization, and I think it gives a lot of credibility to the organization and its assertions. But considering that the city is contemplating whether to adopt this, endorse this, thank you, I'd appreciate if you'd speak more about who are the sources of your information. On what information do you base the assertions for this whole argument that would help people see the viability of your proposal?
Well, the sources of information about what would happen if the proposal were adopted, if carbon fee and dividend were adopted?
Just the whole science and economics and logistics that you've suggested.
We did commission a consulting firm that is a specialist in energy and economics to run these models, and I can send you the report. That's the source of the projections that if this were enacted, we would cut carbon emissions in half in 20 years. The source of the evidence about how big the dividends would be, the lives saved from lung disease and so forth. We also have there evidence about which occupations would gain in jobs and which would lose and so forth. Would that answer the questions, or are there other questions besides those?
Just maybe who some of the experts are that you have on your staff, or who makes up who are your staff that inform your work? Just anything that somebody might wonder about the organization. And
we can certainly send information, all that we have about the organization. It's a very lean staff. There's the entire national budget, last time I heard about it, was $1,500,000 for a national organization, and there's very little paid staff. We're almost all volunteers. But can you help me remember these questions? We need to send follow-up information about where the information came from and the organization itself, so people could check.
Early on, you suggested that the fee was not regressive because the poor have a smaller carbon footprint. Have they done any research over the life of it? Because it would seem that the wealthy can afford to make changes in their carbon footprint that the poor will not be able to do, that they will have the less efficient carbon using heating and cars and everything else that they will not be able to change because they're poor, and that the wealthy will be able. Has that been put into the model to see what the long-term effect is in terms of being a regressive fee?
The study of the effects on individual households does look at households at all income levels, and it shows that at the higher income levels, the costs due to the fee will go up more than the dividend for high-income people in the first year. The study we have done doesn't go beyond the first year. So it doesn't reflect changes that people make in response to the fee as it goes higher. But you know, one of the differences in carbon footprint are that poor people take the bus, they don't even own a car, they live in an apartment, they don't own a house, they rarely fly on a plane, while high-income people have multiple cars, multiple houses, fly on planes a lot. So my guess is that as the carbon fee gets higher, high-income people will make some adjustments, but they will still end up having a larger, the cost of the fee will be larger than the dividend because the dividend is equal across the board. Thinking not so much about the poor people and I can't adjust, but about the sources of the high emissions of the effluent. That's my guess. The poor, 90% of families below the federal poverty line. I don't remember what the income level is of the federal poverty line, but it's in this report, and I could also give you that.
I believe it's something over $20,000 a year.
Oh, it's well under that, I'm pretty sure.
For a family.
Yeah. Well, for a family, maybe it's over that. Yeah. Anyway, I can get it, and yeah, but it'd be better to get this report. Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Right.
Sorry, we got one back there, and then
And I'm going to
I'll get it.
respond to a previous question that asked you about the science behind this. And I would just recommend that you go to Bill McKibben's organization, 350.org, which is more science-based. And you'll quickly find what 98% of the professionals in the field have consensus on. Thanks. I had some questions about cost. Initially, it seemed to me that if you increased the fee by $10 a year to $2,035, it would be an astronomical cost for fuels, but I made a rough calculation, and it looks like the price of a gallon of gasoline would go up about $2. Is that about right?
They tell us that $10 per ton on carbon is about a cent per gallon in gasoline. So the first year, $15 per ton would raise gasoline prices around 15 cents per gallon. Second year, it'd be up by 25 cents per gallon since the beginning, and so forth. So by 9 years, it would be up by about $1.
Yeah, that's not too different from my very rough calculation.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
And the second question is, I presume that the fee is on the fuel, the weight of the fuel, and not the weight of the carbon dioxide that's produced. And I'm wondering if there's consideration of having different prices on different fuels. For instance, a ton of coal is going to produce a lot more carbon dioxide than a ton of methane. So how do those cost figures work out?
Yes, exactly. The proposal is that the fee would be based on the amount of CO2 in the fuel. So the fee on coal would be twice the fee on natural gas.
Yeah, good. I'm glad we straightened that out. I thought differently.
Yeah, yeah. And so that creates an incentive for everybody, and it also splits the industry. And that's what's already happening even without this law. The natural gas is taking over from coal in electricity production, but this would move it even further, giving incentives to shift to gas first, and then as it gets more expensive, away from that.
Since I have the microphone, I'll make one other comment. It's now about 8:30, and these dialogues normally run from 7 to 8:30. We can continue this conversation, but if some want to leave, you're welcome to leave now. We might take a little break if we want to continue this. Also, there's a clipboard going around with an opportunity to sign up, and I'm not sure if we thought to circulate that, but if you,
right here.
It's up there. We would love to have your name if to know who was here tonight. So I would appreciate if you sign up.
Yeah. I'm a member of the local CCL chapter, as are several of my friends here, and there are a couple things up here. If you wish to leave your email address, we'll let you know reminders of our monthly meetings and other events that are going on. This is our folder, which describes the carbon fee and dividend proposal that you've heard about, as well as telling about our local events. And John mentioned the Wednesday afternoon introductory phone call. Every Wednesday afternoon at 5 o'clock Pacific time, you can dial into the number that's on this and give the passcode that's here, and you get a conversation with people that describe the CCL, what goes on. Some of the same information you've heard tonight, but also tells you a little bit about how we came into being and what current events are happening. And so pick one of these up if you want to listen into that phone call. And Don, Karen, Rob, anybody else? Dan? Yeah, and Dan Peterson's back here, so talk to one of us if you want to know more.
And one other thing, if you'd like a handout from Sustainable Claremont, we have them on the side chairs over there. We have some information on each of those items that we had on the initial slide, or things that are coming up. And thank you all for coming.